Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Colvin, and I am the Public Programs Curator at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And I am so excited to welcome you to our very first presentation in a new virtual program series, Alabama History, Behind the Scenes. These occasional presentations will take the public behind the scenes to explore how archivists, curators, and historians bring our state's history to life. And for this very first presentation, I am so excited to introduce you to one of my colleagues, Dr. Hayden McDaniel. Hayden is an education curator at the Department of Archives and History. She has a bachelor's degree in English and History from Troy University, a master's degree with a public history certification from Auburn University, and a PhD in U.S. history from the University of Southern Mississippi. Her dissertation research focused on agricultural policy after World War II through the lens of the Southern peanut industry. Her current research interests center on the South, civil rights, women's history, oral history, and public history. And today she's going to help us commemorate the centennial of the 19th Amendment by presenting Rediscovering an Alabama Suffragist. Hayden, welcome.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you everybody out there who's watching today. I'm very excited to get the chance to talk to you a little bit about Scotty McKenzie Frazier, and I hope you all will stick around through the duration of the presentation and go ahead and start leaving your questions for me down in the comments below, and I'll see if I can answer them. We'll talk about them together at the end. So what I want to do is I'm going to have two parts to my presentation. The first little bit is going to give you some background into who she was, what she stood for, what she believed in. And in the second half, I want to talk to you about my research, the process of doing so, what I found, and some of the challenges of doing research on women, on this particular woman, and how she fits in to women's history more broadly. So we'll go ahead and get started without further delay. So who was she? Who was Scotty McKenzie Frazier? Well, she was born September 7th, 1884 in Talladega to William and Leela Hood McKenzie. She attended Talladega Public Schools, and those are the earliest documents that I've been able to find from her are her being on the honor roll and such. And so it's really interesting to see her growth through that school system. And in 1901, she graduated from Talladega High School. And at that point, she chose to attend the Judson Female Institute there in Marion. And at the time, they had 4 departments in the school. They were literary, music, art, and home. And I'm unsure what she took her degree in, to be quite honest with you. I've done a little bit of research on that, but based on the things she did later in life, I believe she probably took it from the literary department. So she's there in Judson for 2 years. She graduates in 1903. And at that point, she seeks her certification to teach school. And she immediately moves back to Talladega and teaches in the Talladega public school system for 2 years. At that point, she then bounces up to Albertville, teaches at the Albertville Agricultural School for 2 years also, and then goes kind of out of that region down to Greenville Public Schools, where she taught for a year from 1907 to 1908. In 1908, she's actually elected faculty at Judson, which by this point had become Judson College. But she never assumed that role because she married Dr. Alfred Smith Frazier on October 21st, 1908. And they immediately, almost as soon as they get married, moved to New York City so that he could complete his residency at the New York Postgraduate Hospital. One of his posts, and I'm going to ask you to hang on to this information until later in the presentation, was as a surgeon on a United Fruit Company ship. So I thought that was interesting to find. While he's doing his residency, Scotty is not just sitting around and hanging out and doing things that you might expect a woman in the early 1900s to be doing. No, she goes back to school. She attends the prestigious Columbia University School of Journalism. And also during this time, she begins her iconic, at least in my opinion, series in the Montgomery Advertiser entitled Alabama People Who Have Made Good in New York. And this series, what she did was to profile different Alabamians who were living in New York, just like she was. And these were like doctors, people in the arts, and other such important individuals that she had met. And so she wrote about them in those articles for the Advertiser. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Also during this time, as if those things weren't enough to keep her busy, she cultivates her suffrage persona in New York City during this time. And her views on suffrage, though often very forthright, were presented moderately. So her goal was to come at the situation with reason rather than emotion, because she thought that people would respond better to that and to those arguments that were rational rather than emotional. So an example of her expressing this, a more radical opinion, actually is in this one by about Mrs. Carrie Chapman Catt. And if you're familiar with the suffrage movement on the national level, she was a big suffrage leader. And so Scotty uses different details about her life and also quotes from Mrs. Catt to sort of couch her views of suffrage and speak a little more candidly about it within the context of someone else's activism. So these are some of the early inklings of her views on suffrage sort of coming to the forefront and coming out in her chosen medium of the written word. Also, one of the major stances that she took was the equality of the sexes, and this is almost to a fault. She was always very cognizant about mentioning the role of men at the same time she mentioned the changing role of women. So, for example, in the article there, Mr. Burnett L. Clark, she explored the belief that some anti-suffragists held was that men could speak for women at the ballot box, and also the idea that some people held of suffrage activism being kind of socially distasteful. So of Mr. Burnett L. Clark, she said, quote, "Mr. Clark is the type of man that always grants first place to woman. To know him and see his deference to all women is to believe that he is ready and willing to tie up the ballot in American beauties and present it to women just because she wants it, not even making her resort to the stump in her rights." So that's just a little example there of how she expresses deference to men within the context of her activism. So we're about up to 1915 in her career, and her movements around this time are kind of difficult to sort out because there's evidence that she moves back to Dothan, or not to Alabama, excuse me, for a little while, and then back to New York City. But we do know that by the end of 1915, she and her husband, Dr. Fraser, were settled permanently in Dothan. And the reason that they chose Dothan was because it was an up and coming area for medical work. And they wanted to open a hospital, or he did, with Dr. John Ellis. And if you're familiar with Dothan history, the Fraser Ellis Hospital, this is where that Fraser comes from. So, and she stays there for the rest of her life. She was involved with some of the business side of the hospital, as well as in feeding patients. So she had that going on for her as well. So as I've mentioned, Fraser was pretty well connected in society and with different interest groups and that sort of thing, both in New York City and in Alabama. So it's not really out of the ordinary for her to be profiled like that image you see there on the left. That's an article in the Montgomery Advertiser by Mrs. P.L. Matthews, who goes into depth about Scotty's position as a socialite, journalist, and suffragist. And of Scotty's views on suffrage, Matthews wrote, quote, "Scotty McKenzie Fraser is one of the slickest little suffragists that ever came back south. She is so clever with her irresistible feminist arguments that even the crustiest old Southern aristocrats decide to let all the women, like her, vote after she has talked a while." So this is something else that she used in her position statements on suffrage. If they would just let her explain to them why suffrage was important and why suffrage mattered, that they would be convinced. If she could just have a chance to do that, they would be convinced. So Matthews also proceeded to frame Fraser's perspective against social concerns of women entering the electorate and against some of the more unsavory elements of society at the time. And so she writes, it's a little bit of a lengthy article, but I think it captures some interesting points. When you get off to yourself, you can think up all those facts about women being exempt from jury service, army service, alimony, hanging, poll tax, and all those little things. And those are all in reference to the ballot, right? You can remember that it is a criminal offense to speak out in public against a woman's good name, that swearing in the presence of women is punishable by law, that a man can be prosecuted for marrying a young girl, but that a scheming woman can marry a 16-year-old boy and there is no legal protection for him. You can think of just a number of ways in which men have sought to protect and provide for women because the women have had no voice in the government and because it is just simply the natural thing to do. All of these things you can work out in your own mind, but when you tell them to Scotty Mackenzie Fraser, she will say, yes, of course, and it was sweet and lovely of them. Men are dears, and I do like them. But you must not forget all the poor, unfortunate women and children who need women to vote. So that's the mindset that she took to Dothan. And this is just a little backstory on Dothan's suffrage involvement. In about April of 1916, I was able to find that a national organizer named Lola Trax visited, and it was reported that a suffrage organization was formed there. However, after the April 1916 date, there's no evidence that they did anything, that they elected any membership, nothing like that. So I kind of think that it fell through, maybe perhaps it didn't have the right structure at the time. Um, but in 1917, I was able to find that Lola Trax comes back to Dothan again. And this time, a couple of days after that meeting, we find out that Scotty Mackenzie Fraser was elected general chairperson of the Dothan Equal Suffrage Association. And you continue to see that growth through her involvement with the state organization and on the local level. It's not long after that that she becomes the third district representative on the statewide organization's executive committee. So she rises pretty quickly through the ranks, and I think that's partially because of her society acumen at the time. She was already pretty well connected. Um, Now, I said that she was in Dothan in 1915, and this first attempt was in 1916. I'm not sure why she wasn't involved at that time. I'm wondering if it's possibly something with getting the hospital together or if she didn't know about it, but she had clearly expressed her leanings on suffrage before 1916. So it's interesting that she wasn't involved at that point either. So around this time, where she becomes the general chairperson in 1917, her activism evolved. She was a voracious traveler, and that's something that I'm very interested in looking at in her later life. She did a lot of traveling after her husband died prematurely. And so it's on one of these trips that was ostensibly about visiting friends, which is what the newspapers reported. She used it to promote the cause of suffrage. This trip was to Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and New York. And this is also when she started to develop another feature of her arguments towards suffrage, and that was that suffrage was part and parcel of the war effort. Now, at this time, the United States is becoming involved in World War I, and so she's using that to talk about suffrage as a patriotic endeavor, right? And if people want to be patriotic and not like the Kaiser, they will give women the vote. And that's kind of something that she'll say a little bit later. One example of this that I want to kind of explain to you is from the Selma Times, in which she recounted her time in Ohio. She interacted with many women while she was there, many of them anti-suffragists, actually. And the women would often ask when they found out she was from Alabama, if she was from Montgomery. And the reason they wanted to know that is to know whether she had kept tabs on the boys in training there. And Fraser got upset by this because she wanted to know, why do you wish the women to see that your sons are protected from disease and temptation? I thought your platform was one that says all women should protect the home. In fact, stay at home. This particular woman replied, I do believe that a woman's place is in the home, but you see, Uncle Sam has taken our boys out of the homes and put them in cantonments. And unless the women look after the boys in the camps, they are not looking after the home. This is exactly what Scotty wanted to hear. This lady had walked into her trap, and so she rebounded pretty quickly and said, "That's exactly my suffrage trump card. A woman's place is in the home, but the home is no longer four walls, but the world." This notion also pervades another article entitled Suffrage Greatest Question Before Alabama People. The two major focuses of the article is that suffrage is not a revolutionary idea and that it was integral to the war effort. Fraser often compared men who neglected to support women's suffrage to the Kaiser and claimed that, quote, suffrage work is war work. And when we work for suffrage, we are fighting for the democracy of the world. So after about 1918, there are fewer articles that I've been able to find that address her leanings towards suffrage. But that doesn't mean, and I don't believe it means, that she fell out of the suffrage movement. She was actually active, because I've been able to find sort of different ways of finding her activism there. She delivered lectures to increase awareness of the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association. She continued her writing and society work. She was also one of the women who was involved with the 4-Minute Men Conference in Birmingham. And this was a major initiative under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson to deliver wartime related information from the Committee on Public Information. And so that 4 minutes was meant to be short enough to keep people's attention, but also deliver critical information. So she was one of the few women that was invited to be a part of this initiative. And I just want to say again, just because I haven't been able to locate anything else regarding her views on suffrage, she clearly remained politically active. The article there on your right is a program for the 35th annual session of the WCTU, or the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was held in Dothan at the Foster Street Methodist Church in 1920, the year the 19th Amendment was ratified, actually. Fraser was one of the key speakers, delivering a speech entitled Responsibility of the Woman Voter. And so this to me indicates that she had seen suffrage through to the 19th Amendment and wanted to help add her voice to what women did next, what happens now. Also, it's one of those moments where I wish I had that speech, right? I would love to know what she said, but that's also been something I've been unable to find up to this point anyway. After this, she regularly participated in the Alabama Federation of Women's Clubs, Alabama Literary Association, and the Alabama League of Women Voters. And though she had been writing for as long as I can track her, it wasn't until 1920 that she published her first book of poetry, starting the second stage of her writing career. She ended up writing 2 additional books of poetry, and one was based on a recurring series in the Dothan Eagle entitled As We See It. She also served a tenure as editor of the Alabama Digest and briefly for the Dothan Eagle. And the next phase of this project, I want to look more at these accomplishments and examining her contributions to literature, society, and politics. And in order to do this, I'd like to look more at newspapers, of course, and I'd like to get my boots on the ground in Dothan itself. I'm from Dothan, a little bit of full disclosure there. And Fraser Ellis Hospital is something I've heard about. My stepmom is a nurse there, and it's still kind of in the community's consciousness. And I'd really like to know more about that. And if I can find more information about how she was involved, I'd love to do that. There was also a book club, and she was originally a member of this book club, but the club decided to name it in her honor later on. And at the Wiregrass Archives there at Troy University, Dothan, they do have a collection that recounts some of that club's goings on. So I do have quite a bit of work remaining. I know she was involved with starting a museum of sorts in Dothan and was a world traveler after the death of her husband in 1934. So she's just such an interesting character, and you start pulling one thread and you see all these other things come together. Very fascinating, and so many different things to explore in regards to her life. So now at this point, I'm going to transition the presentation to talk some more about the research process and some of the challenges that I've had. I originally got involved with this project after I finished my dissertation. I was very interested in trying to find a completely different research topic. I wanted to get back into women's history, which is something I didn't do in my dissertation, and something I'd done a little bit of early in my career. And so I knew the commemoration for the centennial was coming up this year, and I said, you know what, this is my chance. And those first two questions that you're seeing on your screen now were the questions that were in my mind. I didn't go looking for Scotty Mackenzie Fraser. I didn't know who she was. I thought, well, I know that the suffrage movement was kind of important in Selma and Birmingham, had kind of a big push there. And again, I'm from Dothan. I was curious who was involved with either suffrage in Dothan or the Wiregrass more broadly. I was open to finding whoever that person was. And I found Scotty. The second two questions there are questions that have arisen for me as I have continued to do the research. And I hope to have some answers in a final research project. Ultimately, especially for that last question, I think that's ultimately going to be the direction that I take this project on Scotty, is to take her as an example of the changing perception and role of women in Alabama society. So just to give you a little bit of behind the curtain there. So before I dive into the research specifically, I want to make sure everybody out there knows about newspapers.com. If you don't, it's a wonderful resource where participating newspapers can contribute scans of their back issues, right? And in Alabama, that can go as far back as early statehood. I should mention that the archives does have subscriptions to both this and Ancestry. I will mention Ancestry a little bit later. And they are both free for researchers. Right now, of course, because of the pandemic, there are certain procedures that you have to do in order to research in our building. But I wanted to make sure that you were aware of this resource that we have. So when you're on newspapers.com, these papers are completely searchable by term, by chronology, by newspaper type, the name of it or whatever. So whatever you're searching for is gonna come up with something, right? It may not be specifically what you're looking for, but if you search my name, you may see somebody else's name that's not me. So it's you have to be careful when you're searching, and you have to be specific about how you search, if that makes any sense. You've seen a lot of newspaper articles throughout this presentation, and there's a reason for that. As I mentioned, I didn't know that I was looking for Scotty Mackenzie Fraser. I knew that I wanted to find somebody in Dothan or the Wiregrass that was working for the cause of women's suffrage. So that's how I initially started, with suffrage and Dothan, right? And I think I contained my search from about 1910 to 1919 to see if I could capture some of that high point of suffrage activism. I want to encourage you that if you're searching on newspapers.com, don't give up. It's not Google. It will be searchable, like I said, but it's not Google. You have to be persistent and patient to get what you're actually looking for. So with that being said, I have specific reason for showing these articles. Now, the left one you've seen before. The other one is another example of her Alabama people who have made good in New York articles. But right above it, you might see a picture that you've noticed if you're familiar with the suffrage movement in Alabama. And that picture was taken of suffragists on the Capitol steps in Montgomery just before a statewide amendment was being voted on by the legislature. So I thought that juxtaposition was very interesting. But that's not really what I wanted to point out specifically. I want you to look at those bylines. I know you can't really see the full page, but those, every time that Scotty wrote something, she chose to have three names given for herself: her given name, Scotty, her maiden name, and her married name. And so much of what I'm going to talk about in the remainder of this refers to how people refer to her and how she referred to herself. So just getting that baseline for you of this is what she would have wanted kind of thing. I am always adamant, therefore, that when we talk about her, when I talk about her, that I use all three names for her. So just on the heels of that, this is an issue that you're going to run into if you're searching for people in early, for women, especially in the early 1900s. you're gonna come up with their husband's name, right? I've shown you those two images on the left before from the Dothan Eagle. And like I said, some of my initial searches were for Dothan and suffrage. And so I can't remember which article I found first, but I'm reasonably certain it was one of these that gave initials of her husband's name or the Mrs. Alfred S. Fraser. So I was like, who is this person? I don't know what her name is, and I don't really know what his name is on top of that. So I saved these and added them to my research. And as I was continuing on with that, I found an article kind of like what you see there on the right. Now, this one also does refer to her by her married name, but it does something really awesome for the researcher. It says Mrs. Alfred Smith Fraser, gives you his full name, known in literary circles as Scotty McKenzie. So having that connection to say, okay, if somebody is being referred to as Mrs. Alfred Smith Fraser, Mrs. Alfred S. Fraser, that means Scotty Fraser, right? Scotty McKenzie Fraser. So it's taking articles like that and backtracking with what you already have to verify what you're seeing, if that's the right person, if that makes any sense. So once we know her name, then there's the issue of not having just one name to search for, but a matrix of names to search for. Right here, you see 3 different ways to search just for her married name, right? Then it's her Scotty McKenzie Fraser name. And if you're searching for anything that she did before 1908, which is when she got married, then you're searching just for Scotty McKenzie. So if you're keeping score at home, that's at a minimum 5 different ways of referring to the same person. So that can be a real challenge to make sure that you found everything about the person that you're looking for. But as I said, there's a little bit of silver lining here with this. Not only does it give his full name, it gives us her full name. And that is where Ancestry can come in, and you can find some of those vital records about her and him and piece the things together. So I did that on Ancestry, and again, that is a resource we do have here at the archives. And that is how I found their marriage certificate, the census records that she's listed in, publications that she wrote or appeared in, her overseas travel because they were documented a certain way, and her grave and burial location. And so these are critical components to the skeleton that we can then add the flesh of those stories and fun things that we talked about earlier onto. So it's been critical, even though it's hard to see who we're talking about when they're just given as their married name. We have to take what we got, and be able to work backwards from that. So not to belabor this point too much, but I wanted to show you a few additional articles that solidify her own personal identity and how she preferred to be known. These articles, this one in particular, also show just how well connected she was. I know I mentioned that earlier, and I just want to, reiterate. She was she was traveling in all of these social circles in Alabama, and we don't remember who she was, right? So the Advertiser article, hopefully you can see that there. If you're not aware of that Kilby name, the article is referencing Alabama First Lady Mary Elizabeth Clark Kilby, and she was married to Governor Thomas Kilby. So she was hobnobbing with the First Lady of the state, and this was not the first or last time that she would do that. Shifting gears just a little bit, the articles from the Dothan Eagle and the Selma Times Journal both reference Fraser's work with the Alabama Equal Suffrage Association. And the one there from the Eagle helped me to know for certain that the Mrs. Alfred S. Fraser referred to in the previous slide, that one there in the center, which also talks about her role as the 3rd District chairperson, it made me realize that that was the same person. Again, it's making those connections that you can based on the context that you're given in individual articles. So in the Times Journal article, this was something that was quite interesting to me, and I don't have an answer for it. And that's something that historians just have to sometimes accept and be good with. So this is talking about the suffrage jubilee in Birmingham, and Scotty is listed in context with 3 other women who you may have heard of, Mrs. J.B. or Carrie Park of Selma, and of course, Mrs. Solon or Patty Ruffner Jacobs of Birmingham. Now, none of these ladies, from what I can tell, wrote this article, but what's interesting is that two of three of these ladies, who are absolute giants in the field of suffrage in Alabama, were listed by their married name, but Scotty is not. So somebody made a deliberate choice to refer to her in that way, but not the other two ladies. And again, I don't have an answer for this. If I were to speculate, I would say that perhaps it's because of her society acumen and her literary involvement that people just knew her as that, and it wasn't out of the ordinary for them in certain circles. But it could also just be, and I didn't know her personally, it could also just be one of those things where she you knew, like when you were around her, you knew, you know what I'm saying, that she gave off that vibe that you had to call her a certain thing. But that doesn't then account for other articles that don't do that. So again, this is just interesting, one of those interesting problems that you might not have an answer for and might not know what to do with, but it's just something to think about. So something else that can be problematic is she actually has one of those names that can be spelled multiple ways. So there are many articles that refer to her Fraser with a Z versus Fraser with an S. And so in addition to those 5 ways that we were talking about just a little bit ago, you also have to throw in here this different spelling of her last name and again, to make sure you're actually getting everything um, about her that's out there that's possible to get, right? And I specifically wanted to note, again, to show her connections, there, that article in the center. It not only misspells her name, as you can see pretty clearly, but it also gives her married name and shows her connection to the former First Lady of Alabama, Laura Montgomery Henderson, and she was married to the Governor Charles Henderson, who was from Troy. So I wanted to include this slide because sometimes doing research, it's not just as easy as reading between the line or to see the byline and to know exactly what you're looking at, and it's just super straightforward, and these two are representative of some of the things that I've had to do to suss out the correct things that happened, right? Um, the article there on your left is one of Scotty's most important pieces detailing her views on suffrage, but there is no byline. So at first glance, you can't really tell that she would be the main focus of it. It's because of the way that that article is written. It is recounting an interview that was done. And so the interviewer will intersperse their own thoughts and context with things that Scotty directly quoted. So as the researcher, I had to read it carefully to know which parts were hers and which parts were the other person's, so that I could make sure that I got her opinions represented there. So earlier in the presentation, if you all think back just briefly, I asked you to remember that Dr. Fraser served as a surgeon on a United Fruit Company ship. Now, if you're familiar with the company Chiquita, that's the same thing. I found this article on the right from the Buffalo Times that references a Miss Scotty McKenzie of Montgomery, Alabama, who had taken passage, quote, to don overalls and work as a laborer for one day on the Panama Canal. So if we think about it just a minute, based on what we know about Scotty, there's some problems with thinking that this person that this article is referring to is the same person. First of all, it says MISS, right? There's no married name. There's no Fraser listed there. And it would have been after she gotten married. So this is 5 years after the fact, right? Um, so could it be a different Scotty McKenzie from Montgomery, Alabama? Certainly. However, knowing what I know about Scotty and the sort of moxie that it would take to do this and to go don overalls and work on the Panama Canal, I gotta believe that this is the same person. I tried to corroborate the ship's name that's listed here versus the one that Alfred was on, but his is not listed. So I can't do that and be 100% sure, but it's just too much of a coincidence, in my opinion, that this lists going on a United Fruit Company ship and he's got a post as a surgeon on a United Fruit Company ship. So again, one of those things that we may not have an answer for, but it's just something to think about and something that you can take the context of that corpus of research you've already done and apply to specific resources you find. So at this point, I want to talk a little bit about the archival research that I've done. And about a month after I'd started doing this research in earnest last year, I'd reached out to Dr. Valerie Burns, and I don't know if Valerie's on the call, but hi, Valerie, um, who I knew had done some research on suffrage in Alabama and who was a Judson graduate. And I, again, found out that Scotty was a Judson graduate. And so I tried to pull that connection, and that was one of the best things I did in this whole process. She was able to connect me to the special collections there at Judson, which made it very easy for me to get in and see what I needed to see. Um, the the one thing that was super cool was when I first got there, we arrived and the director of special collections there handed me the picture that you've seen already. It's in the uh, promo for this presentation, as well as earlier in the presentation. She handed it right to me, and it was really cool to be able to see that because I hadn't really had my hands on a picture of her yet. So it was nice to put a face with a name. And not only did I look at Scotty's vertical file, and if you're not familiar with what that means, it's a group of information, documents, pictures, blah, 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 that about an individual group or organization that otherwise doesn't fit into a larger collection. It's put in a folder, put in a filing cabinet, vertical file, right? But Valerie also knew to ask for some other collections based on her knowledge of them because she had processed them as a graduate student. And so there in the middle is the coolest thing I think we found, which was a lock of Scotty's hair. That's her hair right there. And those were gathered from all of the girls in the graduating class of 1903. So that was a pretty interesting artifact. And finally, and perhaps the most recent development in my research, was discovering Scotty's birth date and death date and cause of death. So census records, I had been able to find that Scotty was born in September of 1884. I had seen at least one resource online to list a date within that month, but I was unable to corroborate it against any other sources. I wanted to make sure that this online source was correct. And so I never used it when I was talking about her or writing about her before. And it hit me one day. I was like, oh, she died in 1964. Perhaps there's a death certificate on record for her. So I reached out to our friends at the Alabama Department of Public Health, submitted my fee, and they were able to find for me Scotty's death certificate. And I was able to verify that her date of birth is September 7th, 1884, and that she did die in November of 1964. Um, and I think she died of heart failure. Um, but just as with ancestry, this particular piece is critical to the overall skeleton that I'm trying to build that adds structure to all that flesh and cool stories that we already know and that I've presented on earlier. So these are some cool things, and always reach out to your friends if you have people that you know. We all love to help. And so one final thing before I close, and this was something that I added yesterday. I've spoken a lot about how she was referred to, how she referred to herself. And when I first saw her headstone and that it said Mrs. Alfred S. Fraser, it really kind of made me sad because she died after 30 years after her husband did. And I understand that in the context of the early 1900s and in the 1960s, it was kind of a badge of honor for a woman to have that connection to a man, right? But for Scotty, who had been so adamant throughout her whole career, early on in the 1900s, she was referring to herself by all three names. To see her headstone not reflect that was really kind of upsetting. I believe I was able to find on her death certificate that the person that was notified of her death, and I believe it's her sister Aline. And so I think maybe her sister, arranged for this and thought this was a very good thing that she was doing. But again, based on her corpus of work and the things that she had done, I think it should be different, and I would love to see it be different. So just something to think about. It is at Memory Hill Cemetery there in Dothan. So that's where I'm going to end. And I just wanted to put my contact information up there really quick. If you do have any additional questions that don't come to you to add into the comments section below, then feel free to reach out to me. I love to hear from you, and I love to talk about Scotty Frazier. So thank you so much. Thank you all for hanging around.
Hello. Yes. Thank you so much, Hayden, for that amazing talk. It was wonderful to hear about Scotty Mackenzie Frazier and your process in finding her. It was so interesting. As Hayden said, we have time for a Q&A. So if you have questions, please go ahead and submit them and we can get to them. But to start off, Hayden, I have a couple questions myself.
Oh boy.
And so one of the things I would like to ask is, this has been a national commemoration all year, right? It's been something across the US. People have been looking into suffrage and the 19th Amendment. And last year we had a statewide commemoration. But what you've shown us here is this really great look at a local history. So what place does local history have in these commemorative years and even in non-commemorative years? Why is it important to look at local history?
Well, you've asked the right question for me because I love local history. I'm involved also with National History Day, and I always tell the kids to talk about local history projects. And the reason that I think local history is so super important and will always be important is because it gives people buy-in. If you can see these people doing things in their communities and being revolutionary, you can you might start to get interested in history. You might also think that you could do those amazing things. But I think it also adds flavor to those other broader stories on the state and national level, because that's where we start to get into the nuance of what people believed in the suffrage movement. And is it a local thing? Is it region based? So there's a lot of things that can come from starting at the local and then projecting it out to the national.
Of tying it to these real people who kind of can make you feel, like you said, you have this connection to the hospital, right? And it's also connecting you to this larger kind of history of Dothan, as well as then helping you find that connection to that national story.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's so critical.
Yeah, and that's something I think really important for, when you're doing this research, is like starting off with that topic. Like the question can just be, what's happening around me? And like,
exactly.
Start the research. And I love that was your kind of guiding question, is like, what happened here? And then you kind of delve in and you never know what you're going to find. And we have one question that came in that's coming off of local history. So we can kind of see. Speaking of local history, where should one look for poll tax rolls to find out who were the first women to register to vote in your community? So this is from Laura. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Laura.
Is that something that you have been able to find out? Like, you've been able to find where you would find where they were registering?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. That's a great point. And I would love to know. I've seen a lot of people asking about, were their grandmothers on that first list? And I definitely would love to know that myself. My grandmother was born in 1919, and that's always been interesting to me to have that connection to, she was born just a year before that. But I don't know. That's a great question, and definitely something that if anybody else out there knows,
Definitely,
help us out.
That's same to me. That this is something that I'm also kind of having that question about. I know I've heard of some people, and I think it's a county by county, who've been able to find it on newspapers.com. Depending on what county you're in, sometimes I think that they had to announce the voters, and as someone might be able to comment and say it's every county. So because I might be mistaken by that, but I think that's one place that you can find a list of people who are enrolling. But that is a really good question. That's something that, would be a great question for one of our people in the research room. Maybe they can help you more for that. We have another question here from Kathy Bowermeck. Have any of you found resources that discussed how she felt or if she worked for racial justice and Black people getting the vote? So what was her
That's a great question, and I don't have a ton on it, and she sort of talked about it in coded terms, right? She mentions the fact that there are certain provisions in the Constitution that will keep certain vote, and she doesn't even say poor whites and she doesn't say black people, but she talks about in sort of this generalized term, there are provisions that will keep the people that you don't like from voting because they're in the Alabama Constitution. So even though I've not found anything like very explicitly saying I don't want black people to vote, it's more coded what I found, and it's very clear to me that's what she means.
Yeah, you see that a lot with even with the suffragists in Birmingham and Selma. It's almost their justification for why it's okay to allow for women's suffrage.
Right.
Expand beyond the kind of women that they would want, right?
Yes.
And so that definitely is she's on par with probably a lot of other Alabama suffragists at the time. Which kind of brings me to another question about, she is this, really well-educated woman, right? And she is very well connected also. And so kind of what role does her class have in how she viewed suffrage, how she worked her story, but also how you were able to find her?
That's also a great question. I would not, none of this, I believe, at least to this extent, would have been possible had she been from a working class background or had she not been of means. And that is, and perhaps most importantly, were she not white. We know that there were working class women who wanted to vote. Do we know their names just like we know Scotty McKenzie Frazier? Not as many, right? Do we know that that there were black people beyond just the few that we hear about that wanted to vote? Absolutely. Are those people that we hear about? No. So she is very privileged, and that has made my process so much easier. Again, we can know about people that don't have names attached to them in the same way that Scotty McKenzie Frazier does. We can know about them, but they are more so in the aggregate. And you have to think about them as more of a unit than you can necessarily about an individual, which is unfortunate, but it's important for us to continue to strive to tell voices of people that are underrepresented and who may not be so obvious in the record. It's important for us to read those silences.
Exactly. So it's kind of, sometimes it can't be something that's maybe written out for you, but it can be something that you find in the absence of what is written there.
Yes, exactly.
Sometimes it's really hard for researchers, to be able to find that nuance of, what can you know? When is it that you just have, like you said, you have to make just like an intuitive leap, right?
Yes.
Is kind of bringing it together. Like, as you said, you don't know why Scotty McKenzie Frazier, his name was out there, but Patty Ruffner Jacobs wasn't, right? But I think you made a great kind of point that sometimes you have to jump to that leap, like
right.
that conclusion of, hey, it might have been because of XYZ. It may have been of this, but it's also being comfortable with the uncomfortable moment that you can't find that information.
Right. And you just have to use your best judgment, and based on the research that you've already done and based on what others have said and how it fits in, and that's what the historian has to do. They have to take all of these bits. It's like putting a puzzle together without the box picture. So it's doing the best you can with what you have.
Exactly. We have another great one this is about Scotty in particular.
Okay.
Could you please give us any titles of Scotty's published work? So where can people, if they want to read the words of Scotty McKenzie Frazier, where can they go?
Her first book, I am not certain what the word means, but it is currently a derogatory term, and so I don't want to say it out loud. So I just don't know the context of what it meant. So I don't want to say that. But then it's Things That Are Mine, which is another book of her poetry, as well as We See It. And As We See It was that sort of serial taken from the Dothan Eagle. And so those are her two books of poetry, or three.
if anyone wants to find out any of the other stuff, they can always email you because you gave your contact.
Absolutely.
They
Absolutely.
can always come back and email you, and you can give them more detailed stuff or even links out to some of the articles.
Yes.
And I will say that while we've been talking, some of our amazing archivists have been answering the poll text question. So I'm really glad that we brought it forward so they could answer it.
Yes.
Carly, Ann, Debbie, and Mary Jo, thank you all so much. They've pointed out that yes, you can find them on newspapers.com. You can also find them on microfilm in our research room. And so you can find these women and where they when they would have been able to register to vote, especially if you're looking for your ancestor, or if you're just looking for any type of research with that, it is available to you on newspapers.com or on our microfilm. And like I said, we have amazing staff in the research room who are so helpful. So anytime you ever have one of those research questions, always feel free to reach out to them. So thank you so much for this presentation. It looks like we have answered some really good questions. And if there's anything else you want to say, last words about Scotty McKenzie Fraser?
Nothing. I hope you all learned something, and I hope you all will think about suffragists in your community and not and not think about them having to be like a Patty Ruffner Jacobs, because I feel like in certain places any activism is activism. And so, getting that connection for yourself, and since we're extending the commemoration into next year, there's still plenty of time. So
there's still plenty of time. I like that. There's plenty of time to find the suffragists in your community and even in your family. So kind of do your research and let us know what you find. So thank you so much to Hayden, and thank you so much to everyone who has joined us. I hope that you enjoyed this behind the scenes look at how to research an Alabama suffragist. And please look forward to our next Food for Thought, which is going to be virtually here on Facebook Live. It's going to be on October 15th when Lisa Lindquist Dorr presents A Thousand Thirsty Beaches, Rum Running to the South. And please also let us know with the survey that we have what topics you'd be interested in for future behind the scenes. Thank y'all. I hope you'll have a great afternoon.